Welcome to StoryTalk, a roundtable appreciating short fiction, a single story at a time. My name is Matthew Schmidt, and I'm here today with al-Sirgany.
Hello.
And Ingrid Wenzler.
Hi.
To discuss a piece from Dear Life by the incomparable Alice Munro. Today's story is The Eye, which follows a Canadian farm family. The narrator is 5 years old at the beginning of the story. And around this time, her parents have a child, and then a second child about a year later. Because of this, they have to hire a nanny. The nanny, Sadie, comes from the city. And so there are some interesting correlations between the city and the country. The narrator takes to Sadie immediately, spends most of her time with her, and so it sets up some different situations between thinking about Sadie versus the mother as strong female role models. And over time, we learn that Sadie is a local idol in that she is performing on the radio, and she sings and plays guitar there. She also loves dancing and frequently goes to the dances on the weekends. The story culminates in Sadie being killed by a driver after a dance, and the end of the story follows the mother and daughter attending Sadie's wake. So, to begin with, what resonates for you in this story?
I think, like a lot of Alice Munro stories, a lot of things resonate for me. One of the things that's particularly a sort of Alice Munro hallmark in my experience is the way in which she's capable of speaking from a present tense, from an older voice, and looking backward into a child's point of view or a young person's point of view, which she does here really eloquently with the young speaker who, to my memory, is never actually named. But she does this lovely looking back and thinking through the processes of childhood and development and how she would have thought about everything from her mother to little boys stuffing cookies in their mouths to Sadie and who Sadie is. And she doesn't ever come back to sort of say, and this is the consequence of what I learned about my own thinking or my own independence, but ends up saying this tremendous lot about that through not only the story that's told, and which is a little simple on its surface, but also through the inferences that are made about the kind of individual she becomes in contrast to the individuals she might have been expected to become, or that her siblings might have been expected to become.
Yeah, Adam, I'm with you. I think what she's doing with perspective is really interesting, both in terms of what you have to say about, bringing an older perspective to this young narrator and, at times really inhabiting what it is to see through those young eyes, and at times offering knowledge or language that a child couldn't possibly have. I think I'd add in terms of perspective that the reversal we get in the story's climax, which I won't spoil just yet, is really fascinating too. And, it's the kind of climax that has a lot of narrative heat and that really, I think, works well with Munro's pacing, which is something that I really respond to. I think the story starts out deceptively simple. The child's mother speaks in platitudes, and the child's frustrated with that. And there's this sense of foreboding that you get early on, but you're not quite clear on what's going to happen on first read. And I think what does surprises and really just takes the story to this new place where you go from this space where everything's kind of clear to a much fuzzier space where truth gets questioned and reality gets questioned, and you're not quite sure what you end up with. I think you were saying something like that, Adam, and I agree that I really like that the story is so in focus and then sort of goes out of focus in a way that makes me think.
Yeah, I think that there's something really lovely about, in particular, the mother's way of thinking, which is not only about, or how the narrator expresses the mother's way of thinking, is not only about how ideally her child should be, but also about creating or sort of willing that child to be in some ways. And immediately when we get Sadie, right, like we learn that the mother is a teacher and wants to, as the narrator imagines, as an older person, correct Sadie's use of a plural second person, like use, and getting rid of that. And so I think that there's something there about a kind of knowledge that's a little more rote or learned or rule following that comes up early on and that has this almost horror movie sense of punishment over the course of things that the narrator is retaliating against intellectually.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's interesting that initially the mother is shown, at least from the narrator's perspective, to be telling her what to do and what to think.
Yeah.
And then we're introduced to Sadie, who allows the narrator to think whatever she wants. And, these contrasting presences, offer some sort of split to her thinking while growing up, right? She's at once drawn to her mother because she's taught her, she's all she's known for at least 5 years before being introduced to Sadie, probably another year or two before Sadie enters the picture. And then all of a sudden, we have this young woman who is popular, who is going out and doing things socially. And I think, right, our narrator begins to think about what she might want to do with her life once she's old enough not to stay at home all the time.
Yeah, I think also in terms of, right, like capacity, there's an early sense of what one should and shouldn't be afraid of. So there's this odd moment where the narrator describes herself as being horrified by Alice growing too big to get out of Wonderland. And she says that her mother was delighted, which may be at her horror, or maybe at Alice in Wonderland, which is a really frightening moment of poeticism. Later on, we're going to get Sadie, who, after describing men kind of grabbing at her at dances or getting out of line, that not only is she someone who wants to pay for her own dances and be able to go and like take care of herself, but says in one of the few times that this story uses quotation marks at all and direct quote at all, there's nothing in this world to be scared of. Just look out for yourself. Which is not only a statement of not fearing, but is a statement that that young girl, the narrator, could look out for herself, that capacity is somehow inherent in her.
And she's also talking about, when going to these dances, she makes a point, as you say, to pay for herself, but she makes a point to leave when the dance is over. She doesn't want to, as she puts it, get caught. Caught in this sense, most likely meaning to either get with a man, get pregnant, or get roped into a marriage before she's ready and or in this location, right? She's even thinking already about, I think, moving away from this town. And, one of these things that comes up is the story is centered around three main female characters, right? The mother, Sadie, and the unnamed narrator. And so I was wondering what your thoughts are on the presentation of gender within the story, particularly because while her father is always there, because he's a farmer, he's always at home, he's never actually in the home, right? Like, the only time he's actually at the home in the story is when he falls asleep for his 15-minute nap on the porch. So he's not even inside, right? He's always out on the farm doing farm things. And then one of the reasons that Sadie is so popular to the rural community is that she sings of loneliness and grief, something a lot of the farmers are interested in, even though, as our narrator tells us, the houses are really pretty close together. You can see another house from your house, but they're still interested in this idea of being a loner, of being out there on your own and forging your way in the world.
Yeah, I think in terms of these female characters and how they get presented, I think I'm most interested in moments where I end up wondering a little bit about them and who they are. So I think with both the mother and Sadie, in a way that's very true to a child's perspective, I think you get them presented very neatly as, a mother who's more constrained and who's more domestic, and Sadie as this woman who's free and independent and not getting caught and paying her own way and doing these things. I think for me, the effect of that early on is that I sort of put them in these boxes and I don't have very many questions about them. And I get to see the mother and scene more. But Sadie really doesn't have much of a voice in this story. We don't see her in scene. We don't get very much sort of shown of her personality that's unfiltered. I think moments where the story starts to open up and break down that neatness get really interesting to me. So a little later in the story, there are these lines. My mother wanted something very badly. Was it nice friends? Women who played bridge and had husbands who went to work in suits with vests? Not quite, and no hope of that anyway. Was it me as I used to be with my sausage curls that I didn't mind standing still for, and my expert Sunday school recitations? No time for her to manage that anymore. And something in me was turning traitorous, though she didn't know why, and I didn't know why either. That's sort of where that interpretation of the mother leaves off. And I think it's moments like those where I start to wonder about these women and their complexity, like, what does the mother want? We don't really get an answer. I have guesses, and I mean, especially seeing the mother at the wake later on, there's a woman who keeps imposing the perspective that Sadie was a little too free, and Munro is super careful in that moment, and that you just don't get the access to the narrator's mother that you want. Those words never come out of her mouth, and you're left wondering, like, to what extent does the mother agree about Sadie?
Yeah, I think that you don't get anything like a direct commentary from the mother on this, and she sort of, for the first time in Sadie's death and in her tragedy, sort of is capable of being sad for Sadie or connecting with Sadie, which is a little grim insofar as I think the phrase that she uses is, "Now that's over," about seeing the body, but perhaps also to the quote that you point to, about being a little uncomfortable with Sadie, or Sadie as being someone who draws her daughter toward traitorousness and away from some kind of structure and formality, which I think is obviously about gender and is also about maybe what we expect something like, the quote-unquote good life to be. And that really gets complicated in that moment that you point to, right? Like, no time for her to manage that anymore, and something in me was turning traitorous, though she didn't know why, and I didn't know why either. I hadn't made any town friends at Sunday school. Instead, I worshipped Sadie. I heard my mother say that to my father. She worships Sadie. My father said Sadie was a godsend. What did that mean? Right? And to Matthew's point, the father is super absent, and we are, even here, he isn't speaking directly. It's reported dialogue, but we're also going to see him come back a couple paragraphs later. My father didn't have much to say. I was my mother's business, except for later on when I got really mouthy and had to be punished. He was waiting for my brother to get older and be his. A boy would not be so complicated. And sure enough, my brother wasn't. He would grow up to be just fine. And I think that just fine is that question of what the good life is, but also I think this idea of the less complicated boy is part of how the thing is presented, that there's something about women in this story that have the potential, maybe because they aren't simplistically grabbing at bodies as they're presented here, or maybe because they're not sort of given to like physical labor all day and like left outside in the metaphorical or proverbial wilds that don't exist but that Sadie sings about, that gives them a place to be otherwise. But women, if they aren't sort of kept in this check here, might go off. And one thing that I keep coming back to is actually about the oddity that, like, maybe not the oddity, just the fact that Sadie does end up being punished in, not directly punished, but has consequences for being who she was, for being a little too free, somewhere in that space between the country parking lot and the beginning of the proper town sidewalk. And I don't know what quite to do with that yet.
Well, yeah, the story does stress the different boundaries within the town and the country, but also culture and society, bodies in space. The sidewalk is interesting because early on, the mother says something about being hopeful that they'll put in a sidewalk between the area of the town and the country so that the daughter can roller skate on that particular pavement. And of course, when Sadie is hit in that exact location, right, that's no coincidence.
Yeah.
Right? That's the difference between like hope and reality. Literally being squashed on the spot. So what do you think about?
And one more sidewalk thought, there's no sidewalk in front of Sadie's house. And a lot of attention to sidewalks here.
Well, I mean, this is rural Canada, right? So,
well, I guess I'm assuming it's Sadie's house where the wake is. It may not be her house.
Oh, no, it is Sadie's house where the wake is.
Okay, right.
Yes. And we also notice, going back to the wake, Sadie's parents are on the couch, and the mother and the unnamed narrator go up to them, and the woman howls at one point. And, the old man told her to hush, right? That's a line in the story. And then the woman that's leading the mother around says, she's taking it very hard. She doesn't know what she's doing. She bent down lower and said, now, you'll scare the little girl. scare the little girl," the old man said obediently. Right? So, again, the man is just aping what he has heard. He has no volition, seemingly, in this story other than not to let emotion come from his wife in a certain respect, which, is another one of those boundary moments. And so I guess I was thinking about what your thoughts were on safety and freedom, or on comfort versus the willingness to seek after reading the story. Because here I'm considering the life in the country as a sort of safe life, in that, within the house at least, there is a certain sort of safety. Like, things go on. Obviously, one of the things that spurs some danger are the births of the two children, or the narrator's two siblings, right? Because that brings in an outside presence, someone from the city, in Sadie, right? Someone who has a certain sort of freedom. And then, right, there's also the idea of comfort, meaning the mother seems to acutely want her daughter to be a certain way, right? And that comes out in the way she tells her how to think, what she should be doing. She gets leery about Sadie, and even confronts the daughter about it. In the story, she says, "You and Sadie talk together a lot. I knew something was coming that I should watch for, but I didn't know what. You like her, don't you?" I said yes. "Well, of course you do. I do too. I hoped that was going to be all, and for a moment I thought it was. Then, you and I don't get so much time now we have the babies. They don't give us much time, do they? But we do love them, don't we?" Quickly, I said yes. She said, "Truly?" She wasn't going to stop till I said truly, so I said it. Right, and so, when I'm thinking of boundaries, the narrator places herself within these boundaries throughout the story, and throughout her thinking particularly. We don't necessarily see her actively in those boundaries so much as her thought process through those boundaries. But what do you think about those ideas?
Well, I think some of the boundaries are imaginative and linguistic, right? So that early on, there's this question about who the mother imagines her daughter to be, right? The little girl who, in the painting of, the Jesus Christ, suffer the little children come on to me moment, is hesitant, is the mother defining what her daughter needs and who her daughter is through a static interpretation of a given painting that would also be confined to a sort of religious space. But I think that for her, I think there are the threats of bodies and objects for the narrator. I think the mother seems to be looking for those definitions, but also explanations, right? Like, one moment that really stuck out to me at the funeral is you have all these people sort of milling around and entering into the story quickly, and, quote, "A girl without a boyfriend going to dances on foot," said the woman who was still being friends with my mother. She spoke quite softly, and my mother murmured something regretful. I think there's something that Munro does spectacularly well by not only using the kind of vernacular way in which people speak, but also emphasizing how that ends up defining who Sadie was, or who she was to them, or explaining to themselves why Sadie is dead. That she is a girl without a boyfriend going to dances on foot is very different than the way the narrator introduces Sadie as someone who, does this, consistent introduction and sings these songs and has this kind of fantastical, imagined version of understanding sorrow that isn't quite matching the actual sorrow of when she refers to the war. I think it's World War II, but like 1940s rural Canada not being quite so full of gamblers and roustabouts and things. And there's something about those defining lines as being something more like real answers that, like, both Sadie's freedom and whimsy, she knows immediately aren't quite real. They're imagined functions of sort of lonely country people sitting alone and romanticizing their lives, but also the roller skate fantasy isn't real. It's how her mother would like things to be, and not there is incidentally, right, like the child she's supposed to be as painted in the picture, right? There's something about seeing there, but it's also taking the seeing and immediately putting it into a definable context.
Yeah, since you talked a little bit about the narrator, I'll talk a little bit about Sadie. I was immediately reminded of this composition class that I taught 4 years ago. The focus was space, and I can't remember the name of this one article. I think it was The Geography of Fear, and it focused a lot on spaces where women feel safe and how they move through the world, and how the way they move through the world is often delimited by notions of comfort, notions of what's dangerous in particular. The way you might feel safe walking on the sidewalk in a particular neighborhood at one time of night, but not at another. The way you might feel safe with two other people, but not alone, that kind of thing. For that same class, I worked a little bit with sections of Jane Jacobs. And interestingly, she thinks a lot about safety as well, in terms of thinking about what makes a neighborhood good. You have to start with safety, feeling comfortable and fine. And the way that Jacobs thinks about that is in terms of kind of a neighborhood watch system and eyes on the street. I think because this story is the eye, I can't help joking a little bit about that and thinking about the eyes in this story and the fact that Sadie is someone who's watched, but sometimes in a way that involves judgment. The narrator is someone who's watched, but sometimes in a way that involves judgment or expectation. And that there can be the safety without freedom in this story. I think in terms of Sadie, as soon as you know that she gets hit by the car, you know that someone's going to say something about the fact that she deserved it, or that she was doing something out of bounds. I expect it to be the mother in one shape, and it's interestingly not. I like it better that it's someone else. I like it that I'm confused about the mother's feelings about Sadie, and that I get glimpses of it. I try to puzzle it out for myself, but I don't have ever an answer that I feel sure of.
Yeah, I think one thing that I'm really fascinated with is that we don't get what happens to this narrator after an allusion to being maybe a teenager when she has a certain epiphany near the end of the story. But we know that in contrast to her brother, she doesn't turn out fine, quote unquote. And I think that some of that is expressed in the fact that the narrator isn't immediately replaceable as a model after her mother or a model after Sadie. And it's possible that I think it's certain that she doesn't want to be seen by her mother in the way that her mother sees her. That's established very early on in her mother's incorrect assumptions about what her desires are. I think she might want to be Sadie, right? She knows she's not a good singer, but she still wants to keep singing. And I'm not sure if it's that she has a recognition that she isn't Sadie or can't be Sadie, or that something doesn't quite fit or is incomplete, but I'm really interested in that not immediately paralleling, but sitting somewhere in between and wanting to be seen and not wanting to be seen, and how that seeing happens being important, right? Like, in the way that, like, being seen by the, like, boys at the dance hall, right? Sadie doesn't want to be touched by them. She either wants to dance with them and wants it to be good dancing or not. And, like, she starts to characterize them in these ways.
Yeah, I think the narrator throughout is consumed by what she should feel. And, you know, what is truth and what is lie, and how she should act in a particular situation. And, you know, I think that really comes out at the scene at Sadie's house at the wake, because the first thing that happens is they go up to the door, they're going to knock on the door, but they don't have to because the door is opened all of a sudden. And not realizing that it was someone opening it for them, but someone coming out, right? They're surprised. And then the person that is coming out yells in to the home that it's them that Sadie worked for, right? Which is what? It's sort of like a warning, right? Here come the country folks, / here come, people who liked Sadie a whole lot more than maybe some of them liked. You know, that it's confusing though. Like it's not ever really stated what the thinking is in that room, but what it does bring to light is you have to act a different way because these people are coming in, right? And even the narrator talks about her mother acting a certain way within this society, right? She modulates her voice. She does the proper movements when she is asked to do the proper movements. She cries when she's supposed to cry, right? And so these things, right, alert the narrator that this, in some ways, is a put on, right? It's what you do in society in a certain way, right? But then maybe the most confusing thing happens, right? We are in this room and we think it's the wake as readers, but the narrator hasn't told us that it's the wake. We're just in a house with a bunch of people. We know Sadie has died. All of a sudden, right, the narrator realizes, in fact, Sadie is in the room, or her body is in the room. She says, as the narrator, there had been a coffin in the room all the time, but I had thought it was something else. Because of my lack of experience, I didn't know exactly what such a thing looked like. A shelf to put flowers on, this object we were approaching might have been, or a closed piano. Right, so that's a really interesting thing in that she's telling this from when she's older, right? But thinking back to how she felt in the room at that time as a younger child. And so there's that inexplicable what is true and what is lies of our memories, but also, she was in the room feeling something like that at the time. It was probably her first wake. She's uncomfortable. She doesn't know most of the people. She doesn't know most of the social cues about what to do. And she doesn't want to look at anything, right? Her idea is, I will keep my eyes closed or look down this entire time we're in here. And it's finally the mother's actual crying that shakes her out of this reverie, and she's able to finally look in the casket at Sadie. And before we talk about that, maybe you have some thoughts on some of the things I just said.
Yeah, I think I have a lot of thoughts, actually. Right. One thing that really draws my attention is the slippage into the child voice right before this moment. Right? So what ends up happening is, just to quote the story, just as I thought this might be possible, I heard my mother, and the woman, what's possible is like seeing the dead body or getting out, right? Like, I heard my mother, and the woman she seemed now to be conniving with speak of what was worse than anything, seeing Sadie. On its own as a paragraph. Yes, my mother was saying, of course we must see Sadie. Dead Sadie. And also its own paragraph, just dead Sadie. And I think that there's something strange about the way that death gets talked about when you're a kid, that captures really well, and that narrator being thrown back to it is captured really, really well, in that you don't exactly understand what death is. I don't think any of us quite understand what death is, but like, you don't understand what death is, but it's still this kind of boogeyman of childhood, and it's something that if you happen to be a farm kid, or just a kid moving around in the world, you're like bound to occasionally catch a dead bird or a dead cow or something. And I actually, that moment struck me so hard. In part, I was thrown back to this, right, like this hospice setting when I was a little younger, and this like person like telling me to say goodbye and then monitoring my goodbye. And I think there's something really, and feeling angry at her like for monitoring my goodbye, because I didn't know that hospice worker, and I didn't have a connection to her, and I didn't have anything to say to my dying relative. And I think those moments can be, right, it's where the structure of our lives and how something like developing a relationship to grief and mourning the dead meets sort of like a momentary feeling of rejection or regret and loss and horror and confusion and the kind of heightened emotions and chemicals rushing through your body that are happening in those moments, that I think is going to come back in the end after there's that odd moment with Sadie's body and how she experiences it, that returning afterwards to herself and sort of rejecting her own belief system, or her own like comforting belief that leaves the world even more open than it already was for her, and that kind of growing up is maybe something closer to what reality looks like, but like fucking scary.
Yeah, I want to go back to one of the lines you read, Matthew, and just some of what both of you have been saying about the sort of doubling of perspective that we have, her present tense perspective, but also this ability to remember and go back to how she saw things as a child. So that line, a shelf to put flowers on, this object we were approaching might have been, or a closed piano. For me, that's one of my favorite moments where she's inhabiting her younger self. I think it's a really beautiful line. I think it helps us see the room. It really lands for me, and I love it that she comes back to it. Another moment where I wasn't expecting a return, but we get just a couple paragraphs later, I was able to see just a blur of the stiff flowers and the sheen of polished wood. It's not exactly a comeback, but the flower is linked to the shelf, the polished wood back to the piano. I think I would love to move us to the climactic moment now, the eye. So what happens to Sadie? What happens to the young narrator seeing Sadie is, she's afraid to look at the body, but she sort of gets her courage up and looks at it bit by bit. There are wonderful lines in the scene where you get to see her looking at the cushion a little bit, looking at parts of her body. and then seeing the whole, and then unexpectedly and wonderfully, we get these lines. Something moved. I saw it. Her eye on my side moved. It was not opening or halfway opening or anything like that, but lifting just such a tiny bit as would make it possible if you were her. If you were inside her, to be able to see out through the lashes. Just to distinguish maybe what was light outside and what was dark. I was surprised then, and not in the least scared. Instantly, this sight fell into everything I knew about Sadie, and somehow as well, into whatever special experience was owing to myself. And I did not dream of calling anybody else's attention to what was there, because it was not meant for them. It was completely for me. When I first read this, I thought the story could end there, but I was so happy that it kept going. I think Munro's tentative about calling Chekhov an influence. She says, I don't claim Chekhov as an influence because he influenced all of us. This story really directly calls to one of his most famous stories, Gusev, in which there are two passengers aboard a ship, among other passengers. Both of them are very sick, and one of them, from the beginning of the story, is personifying everything. He's from the country, he's simpler, and he's looking at the ship as having volition. He's looking at the rigging as having volition. And the other passenger is more educated and of a different class and is condescending toward all this personification and pretty cynical. I think, he realizes that he may have been put on the ship just to die, that the doctors probably didn't want to deal with his body, and that they probably knew that he wouldn't make it all the way back to Russia. So there's this tension between these two characters in particular. There are other passengers, but famously, at the end of this story, both of these characters die, but Gusev dies second. His body is thrown into the water, and you expect the story to end there with man, but in this beautiful way, you start to see the body falling through the water from the perspective of first pilot, ship, fish, and then a shark. And then, you think you're just going to follow the body down, but it's Chekhov, so he does something again, and you go back up above, and you're seeing the world from the sky, and it's just really tremendous and magnificent, and so much about so many things. Like Richard Bausch says of it that it's about the enormity of the world as opposed to man. Personally, I think it becomes a little bit more about that and something else, and the ways in which Gusev's seeing the world right and wrong. He's personifying everything all along, and I think you kind of shoot back into his perspective a little bit as well, and the ways in which, in his simplicity, he's so much wiser than the other man who's more cynical, but also that he gets things wrong, that he's racist, for one thing, and that, when he's in a more cynical mood, he sees his family and their situation a little more negatively. I think this story is deeply in conversation with that story, but really does its own thing and is the perfect homage in that way, in that we get that perspective reversal here as well. But I think I'm interested in talking a lot about the ending and where we think this narrator actually lands.
Yeah, I think that it's been a hot minute since I've read Gusev.
Yeah, don't worry
But
about that. Let's stay with this. I'm
Yeah, no, it's...
took us off into another space.
No, I think that what is interesting about that story, to my memory, is about how we're encountering sort of death and mystery and sort of, right, like, the irritating quandary of, like, what it is to be a conscious thing made up of unconscious meat. And I think that there's something really troubling about those kinds of education, right, that kind of emerge out of actually exactly the kind of education the mother is trying to teach her daughter, right? Like in a lockstep world where grammar has to be you and not use, that not only are you not analyzing the utility of a plural second person, but you're also maybe not, you're giving into some kind of structured framework of how communication should work and limiting the ways in which you can communicate. And I think that science has that particular quality, right? There's something about, you could just lose your faith in the idea that you saw Sadie start to open her eyes because you realize every time you go to a funeral, the eyelashes are a little aggressively like pulled out to create, beauty, and nevertheless have the effect of alternating curves between the eyeball and the like eyelash, and that makes them look open. It could be that kind of thing, or it could be the kind of scientizing reason that says like it's impossible for this body to have sent you a signal. It's impossible for there to be some sort of higher power or communication from the dead that could have reached out to you in this way. You were a child and scared and looking through half-teary eyes at your first body, like these goddamn flowers they always like that people bring to funerals, they always like are just spewing pollen and make you kind of like fuzzed up and stuff. And I think that there's something about what she loses in the end by losing her belief in Sadie actually looking at her and seeing her, that is somehow succumbing a little bit to that world of expectation. And I think that's a real and tragic loss, right? Like it's in fact not going down and passing by the shark, but alternatively like thinking that you passed by the shark and like standing back on the ship, imagining that the dead are just becoming fish food. And it's a much less romantic world. I think it's a harder world. I don't know if it's a more correct world.
I mean, I think it's interesting that, right, that so much hinges on this eye that does or does not move. And, because the narrator is telling this, like, I believe that she thought she saw something, okay?
Yeah.
But I think what she really realizes is that she's finally looking at Sadie. She's looking at Sadie, not that Sadie sees something or that Sadie tells her something. I think she's like, I'm finally like seeing something of the world, not just because it's a dead body, but because she's learning about different parts of the world, particularly the boundaries I was talking about earlier. And that, right, there's this, at first maybe inexplicable thing right at the end of the story that is not inexplicable at all. And that is that the narrator recounts that Sadie quits working for the family and goes back home to, quote, basically take care of her parents. Later on, her mother finds out she was working in the creamery. And that sentence is its own paragraph. And then my mother had found out she was working in the creamery. And then it just leaves that and goes somewhere else, right? To think about her belief. And at first I was like, well, so what? But, obviously so what? It just passed me by for a moment because it was so simple and elegant in that it's just like, boom, not everything you see is what you think it is. And even if you idolize someone, they're not exactly what you think they are. And so it's this idea, I think, of, right, a sensory organ showing her that you have to use more than one sense to get the full picture, to really see.
Yeah, I think that's really well put. And I think I agree with that read. I agree with Adams as well. I think we end up in this place of maturity, but like Adam, I have this question of, like, is all that seeing, a better place or not? I love the teeth.
Yeah.
Leading up to the ending where we're talking about the narrator's the narrator's realization that she doesn't believe that the eye has moved and that she's seen through it. We get this line: "I just believed it easily, the way you might believe and in fact remember that once you had another set of teeth, now vanished, but real in spite of that." I think it's super smart because it's first of all just like a great idea to be thinking about your old set of teeth. But in the way that the creamery moves by so elegantly and simply, she's pointing you to the teeth you have when you're younger and the teeth you have when you're mature in that final moment without being too heavy-handed. I mean, I glide right over it. And, I think that final line makes me feel like the narrator in, potentially writing this story too, thinking about that double perspective, like ending on this line, but having moved through all of this other stuff. And I knew with a dim sort of hole in my insides that now I didn't believe it anymore. I think it's the dim sort of hole that makes me feel like, she's got questions about this maturity as well.
Yeah, I think that sentence really haunts me a lot, not only because it's structured so well, right? Like dim being a visual metaphor, even though what you're actually experiencing is that kind of like acidic, anxious pain in your stomach. But that it's this until one day when I may even have been in my teens, which is so unspecific as compared to that childhood, but has a certainty that's more specific than what she comes to decide of as an imagined experience. And I think that that's a weird kind of loss, and its meaning isn't strictly about Sadie or even strictly about death and loss per se, but it's something more complicated about all the kinds of things we're willing to believe and willing to accept and parse through.
Yeah, Chekhov's story is so much about truth and the kind of truths we engage as well. And I think thinking about that final moment as being in conversation with Gusev adds something for me, makes it richer that, Munro, like Chekhov, I think, isn't satisfied with idealizing either that maturity or this sort of mystical encounter with the I, that it's more complicated with that and than that, and it's kind of both. I mean, I do feel like Chekhov ends up leaning into the spiritual, and I think Munro sort of does the opposite in conversation.
All right, friends. Well, thank you for taking the time to discuss the I today. For those of you out there listening, if you haven't read Alice Munro, do yourself a favor and go read Alice Munro. Amazing short story writer. Amazing writer in general. All right, that is all from One Week Critique at this moment. Look forward to more interviews and, of course, more story talk.
Thanks, Matthew.
Thanks, Matthew.
Thanks.